What's going on, everybody? This is Al from PlaybookGamer.com, and today we're going to look at the 10 hardest BCS conference jobs in NCAA football 06. Now, this is 2005, so we're looking at the 05 rosters, and think about what happened in 2005. This was still the BCS era. This is when the Big East was still kind of a big conference back then. They still competed with the other bigger conferences, and I picked these 10 teams based off how hard it is to recruit there, how bad their initial roster is, in order to give you a good enough challenge out of the gate. Because this is one of my favorite ways to run a dynasty, is to pick a really bad BCS conference team, because you're always going to have a really tough schedule out of the gate every single season. So you're always going to be behind the 8 ball in terms of that and in your roster until you can bring this roster up via recruiting. So in no particular order, let's start off with the Duke Blue Devils. Now, I've ran a dynasty with them several times over the years. My most recent one is on the channel. You can go and check that out. It's a lot of fun, but Duke will always be a challenge because they don't have a lot of roster to work with. They're in the state of North Carolina. That's good. North Carolina produces a decent amount of talent in this game. But as you see here, they got 14 seniors and 20 juniors, so a lot of upperclassmen. So you're going to have a lot of roster turnover, especially in a couple of seasons. And of course, you want to try to rebuild this team as best you can via recruiting anyways. But you look here, they don't have a whole lot to work with overall. You look at their top 6 players, your best players in 85 overall. So not a lot to work with, not anybody in the 90s. And you look at quarterback, we'll go position by position. You got a pocket passer, impact guy, 80 overall. That's great, but not much behind him. You go to a halfback, a bunch of average dudes. You look at fullback, not a lot here. They ran a pro-style offense back then. If you need some blockers, that's good enough. This guy's got 74 speed, which ain't bad. Wide receiver, average. Your best guy is 78 overall. You look at tight end, not much here. 82 overall, 72 speed, and the guy behind him's got 70 speed. So you could probably run a little stuff with them, passing-wise. Offensive line, this is where it gets pretty bad. Tackle, really bad. 74 overall is your best tackle, and he's a junior. Then you got a 72 and a 70, just a bad situation. Guard, one decent one, 82 overall, and he's a junior. Not bad, but nothing behind him. Center, awful situation. Your best guy's a 68. You look at defensive ends, 84 overall, impact guy. Make full use of him while you can because he's a senior. And okay behind him, 78, and it just gets kind of worse after that. Defensive tackle, not very good. Your best guys are 76 and 76. At least that one's a freshman and one's a junior, so that's something to work off of. Outside linebacker, your best guy is 82 overall, then a 76 and really bad after that. Middle linebacker, terrible situation, 68 overall, your best player there. Corner, arguably your best player, John Talley, 85 overall, 91 speed. You got actually a lot of speed at corner and plenty of bodies here. So this is not the worst situation to be in. You go to free safety. Okay, 78 and 76. The problem is they're both seniors. They're going to be gone. Make full use of them while you can after that first year. Strong safety, 74 and 70, just below average. You go to kicker. You got 3 of them. You don't need 3. You'll probably end up cutting a couple just so you can make some room for other players, but they're all bad. Punter, average. So typically Duke is a bad situation. You see here the roster isn't very good. The conference is really tough in this game. You know, Virginia Tech, Florida State, Miami. This is before they all took like their big dips and such. But this is a really tough challenge, but I think you'd enjoy it. Next up is another ACC team, and that is North Carolina. This is another team that doesn't have much tradition in football until much later with Mac Brown got there. But back in the mid-2000s, it was pretty rough. Now, again, they're in the state of North Carolina. Recruiting is going to be okay. It's not the worst. It's not the best in the world, but it's very doable. And you're surrounded by some states that produces decent talent. So on that front, it's going to be fine. Now, you look at their initial roster. They got 19 seniors and 18 juniors. You're going to get a lot of roster turnover. On top of, you got a lot of bad players at the very bottom. So recruiting will be a heavy priority for you out of the first couple of seasons. Now, you start off with their best players, 87, 86, and you keep on going. They got a decent amount of players in the 80s, which isn't bad, but they're a bottom feeder school in this conference. Just trust me when I tell you that. Now let's look at their position. Starting off a quarterback, your best guy's an 80 overall. Just not much to work with here. You got a couple dudes on the back end that can run a little bit at least. You go to halfback, an impact player. Make full use of him while you can. He's a junior too, which is nice. And a bunch of average dudes behind him. Fullbacks, you got several here. They're all going to be blockers, more or less. This guy can maybe do some things for you. True freshman. Make sure you pay attention to that. You can make use of him down the road and use that speed. Wide receiver, not a bad group. 86, 86, 80s. So you got some decent guys to work with along with an impact player. So that's not a bad situation to be in. Tight end, nothing here to really work with. Your best guy's 78 overall, but he's not the fastest in the world at 70 speed. You look at tackles, they got two okay ones, an 82 and an 80. The problem is they're seniors. So you're going to have them for a year, and it gets really bad after that. So you're going to have to really prioritize your tackles. Guards, a freshman, and you got a senior at 78 overall apiece, and then just not much behind him. Look how bad it is on the back end. You got a lot of work to do here. Center, a pretty good one, 80 overall. The problem is he's a senior, and he's just an 80 overall, and there's just nothing behind him. Defensive ends, 84, then it gets kind of bad after that. 78, and a few guys in the low 70s. Defensive tackle, one decent one, 85 overall, but he's a senior, so you're going to have to replace him along with replace some of these other really bad ones. Outside linebacker, not terrible, 80 and 80 and a 78. You can work with that. The problem is two of them are seniors, and you don't have much on the back end. Middle linebacker, a really good one, 85 overall, but it's terrible behind him, and he's a senior, so you got to prioritize the middle linebacker position your first couple recruiting classes. Cornerback, not very good. Your best guy is 78 overall, and not much behind him. Free safety, you got a bunch of bodies here, but your best guy's a 78 overall. At least he's a junior. You go to strong safety, a really bad situation. 72, then 62. You really got to replace these guys. Kicker, not bad. 84 overall. He's a sophomore. You can work with that. And a punter, junior, 84. So at least your special teams will be okay. But overall, it'll be a little easier job than Duke, obviously, especially if you don't want to take on like an academic restriction like you could with Duke. But their talent, there's just still not a ton to work with here. So you got a lot of work to do if you want to compete in the ACC. Next up, we have the Kansas Jayhawks. Now, the biggest issue with Kansas is recruiting. They're in the state of Kansas. It's hard to recruit there. You're not going to get much talent out of that state. You're going to have to go to Oklahoma and Texas, which means you got to spend more points to get some players. But this is actually one of the better rosters you're going to see in this video in terms of at least out of the gate. Now, you look at their upperclassmen, 20 juniors, 19 seniors. There's going to be a lot of roster turnover those first couple of seasons. Now, you look at the bottom here, they got a bunch of dudes in the 50s and 60s you're going to have to replace. So, again, recruiting priority number one those first couple of seasons at least. Now, you look at their top 6 or so players. You got a couple dudes in the 90s, one of the few teams on this list that have that quality of talent. Then you got some dudes in the 80s, and it just kind of gets worse after that. And as you notice, there's not a lot of guys in the 80s either. So you start off at quarterback, a bunch of average guys, 80 and a 78. It looks like pocket passers. So you can at least work off of that a little bit. Halfback, you're going to go do everything through this kid right here. Anytime you have an impact halfback, make full use of it. That's the best place to have an impact status on a player. 86 overall, and he's got an average guy behind him as a freshman, but this kid's a senior. Make full use of him until he leaves, and then you got to get really some better players in here. Fullback, nothing here. They ran a spread offense. This was actually right when they started working with the air raid offense, and they actually had some decent seasons, which means you're going to have a bunch of wide receivers, as you see here. 84 overall, and a bunch of dudes in the mid. Next up, we have the Kansas Jayhawks. Now, the biggest issue with Kansas is the state of Kansas. It does not produce a lot of talent. You're going to have to go to Oklahoma and Texas and maybe Missouri to get some players. You're going to be spending a lot more points in recruiting because of that, so that will always be a challenge. They also have a lot of upperclassmen, 20 juniors and 19 seniors, so there's going to be a lot of roster turnover, especially when you want to get better players in. And, of course, they got a bunch of bad dudes on the back end as well. Now, you look at their top 6 or so players, you got a couple guys in the 90s, one of the few teams on this list that has players in the 90s, and they got a handful of players in the 80s, but then it goes straight into the 70s. So let's check out this roster. Quarterback, average guys, but it's doable. You can make use of these guys until you can bring some better players in, some pocket passers. You got one guy that can run at least a little bit. He's a true freshman, so you can redshirt him and maybe work with him later down the road. Halfback, you got one really good one. He's an impact player. Use him as best you can. But then after that, it doesn't get too good. Now, you got a freshman behind him as a 78, so that's something to work off of. But there's just not a lot of depth here. You're going to have to really prioritize halfbacks the first couple of seasons. Fullback, not much here. This is when they started running the air raid offense back then. So That's why you see a bunch of wide receivers right here. Notice you got an 84 overall wide receiver, your top guy. Then it gets to a bunch of average guys behind him, but at least you got plenty of bodies. So if you want to run a spread offense with the team on this list, this is one you may want to think about. Tight end, okay, 78 overall is your best guy. He's a blocker more or less, but you got a freshman right here that I would really prioritize. He's got 80 speed. Imagine having that type of threat at tight end. Well, now you got one in this particular roster. Tackles, 84 overall, then a 78, and it just gets kind of worse after that. You got a senior and a junior. Guard, junior, and a junior behind him, which ain't bad. So at least you got something to work with here at guard. But notice how many juniors are at your guard position, 5 of them. So you're going to have to prioritize it in recruiting really quick. Center, 76 overall, sophomore. So that's something to work off of. That gives you a little bit of time until you can bring in some better centers. Defensive end, not a lot here, 82 and 78 and 76. Got some speed here, but not a whole lot. Defensive tackle, one decent one and an average one behind them, and it gets really bad after that. And, of course, your best one is a senior. Going to have to replace him. Outside linebacker, this is the strength of your defense, 90 and 87. He's an impact guy. Then it gets kind of bad after that. And these two guys are seniors, so you're going to have to work with it here. I would suggest you may redshirt a couple guys down here to get ready for the grunt of it. Middle linebacker, bad situation. Just 74 overall is your best guy. Corner, one of your better situations. Your best guy on the team is a 92 overall with 93 speed. Hopefully he doesn't leave early. But notice how many seniors are on the team, and he's not one of them. There's 5 of them. So you're really going to have to prioritize this position in recruiting out of the gate. Free safety, 80 overall, 86 speed, and average behind him. So that's not a terrible situation to be in. Strong safety, 76, 74, just okay. Kicker, 74. Punter, 78. Average special teams. Another thing to pay attention to, they are in the Big 12 North. That's the easier of the 2 divisions. So you don't have to play against Texas and Oklahoma every single season. So that's at least a nice bonus, but otherwise a very tough challenge. Next up, we have the Baylor Bears. They have always been an underdog in the Big 12. Now, think about it in 2005. This is right before Baylor was just really good when Art Briles got there in the late 2000s. They just didn't have a whole lot to work with, but there are some positives to Baylor. One positive is during the state of Texas, one of the best recruiting states in the game and in real life, so you'll always be surrounded by good talent, but that's where it kind of drops off. Another big issue they're going to have is you're in the Big 12 South. You are going to be playing Texas and Oklahoma every single season. That's one of the reasons, again, why I enjoy these types of Power 5 / BCS conference dynasties is because you got a tough schedule pretty much every single season. Now, they don't have a lot of roster to work with, not much talent, but they do have a couple guys in the 90s you see as the overalls here. Your best player is a punter, which is cool. You wish he was like a quarterback instead. But you got some decent guys here, but notice it kind of drops off. There's not a lot of dudes in the 80s, so let's just start off at quarterback. A bad situation. You got 2 72 overall guys. They're all pocket passers. You got to work around this somehow. Also, notice before we head into halfbacks, notice they don't have a whole lot of seniors, but they got a ton of juniors. So kind of keep that in mind. Again, roster turnover is going to be a big issue. But quarterback, bad situation. Halfback, you got plenty of bodies, not bad. But 80 overall, 78, 76, just kind of average for the conference. Fullback, kind of the same thing. Not going to get much out of these guys. Wide receiver, you got an impact player, and you got a bunch of dudes that are in the mid-70s. So I suggest you run some type of spread offense early if you want to make full use of these guys. As you can see here, you got plenty to work with. Look, you got a true freshman, David Geddes, 94 speed. Nice to have. Tight end, not much here. Tackle, not much here. 78 and 76, really bad after that. 82 at guard, 76. Center, 76. So your offensive line is going to need a lot of work, to say the least. Defense, look at their ends, 80 overall, and it's really bad after that. Going to have to prioritize it. Defensive tackle, 82 and 80 and 78 and 76. So you got some bodies here. That's not too terrible to have to start off with. Outside linebacker, just kind of average. Middle linebacker, 82 overall, not bad, but he's a senior. You're going to have to replace him. Corner, not a good situation. You got plenty of bodies, but nothing really great to work with. Free safety, 88 overall. Excellent. Senior. But he's going to be gone, so you're going to have to really recruit this position hard. Strong safety, impact guy, 90 overall. One of the positives to this roster is you got 2 really good safeties. It really helps to have good players on the back end, especially in this game. Kicker, terrible. Punter, one of the best in the country. Again, he's technically your best player on the team as an impact guy. Kind of a downer. You really don't want an impact guy, a kicker, or punter. You'd rather use that status on something else. So you got to keep that in mind. Otherwise, again, you're in the state of Texas. That's great. You're going up against Texas and Oklahoma. That's not great. And you don't have a ton of talent to work with. So this will be a fun, challenging build as long as you don't mind having a little easier recruiting situation throughout the dynasty. Next up, we have the Indiana Hoosiers. Now, I ran a dynasty with them several years back. That was a lot of fun. This is a challenging one because, first of all, you're in Indiana. Not a lot of recruits come out of that state. You're going to have to recruit Ohio and Michigan, and that's kind of it, really. Again, recruiting is going to be tough. You're going to be spending a lot more points than some other teams. And Indiana has no tradition in football. So maybe you can turn that into some tradition with a lot of championships with this team, but it's going to be kind of tough out of the gate. Notice we got 15 juniors and 19 seniors, a ton of freshmen, but you're going to have a lot of seniors gone, which means you're going to have a lot of roster turnover out of the gate. And they got bad players on the back end like all these teams do. But you look at their best players. Your best one's just 86 overall. Nobody in the 90s. And they don't have a ton of guys in the 80s, like 10 or so. So this is one of the worst rosters on this list. Quarterback, awful. 72 and 72, just not much to work with. You got to prioritize this in recruiting really early. Halfback, you got plenty of bodies here, and you got a lot of freshmen. Now, your best one is an impact player. Always nice to have an impact halfback, but he's a senior, so make full use of him. And the guy behind him is also a senior, so you may want to think about possibly even redshirting this guy if you need to. But the cool thing is you got 3 freshmen on the back end, all look exactly the same, and they all got some speed to them, so that's just something to keep in mind. Fullback, not much here. I guess they just ran a spread offense of some sort back then. Wide receiver, impact guy, 80 overall, but he's a senior, and there's just not a lot behind him. Tight end, you got bodies here. You only got 2 okay ones, an 80 and a 74, and it gets really bad after that. But at least your top 2 tight ends got some speed to them, and they can catch quite a bit, so that's not bad. So if you want to run a little tight end oriented offense, you can do so out of the gate with this team. Tackles, you only got 3. You got one decent one, but he's a senior, so you only got him for a year, and it gets really bad after that. Guard, 82 overall, your best guy, but he's a senior, he'll be gone. Then you got a 78 senior, he'll be gone, and then it just gets really bad beyond that. Center, just 74, so your offensive line, it's just a really bad situation. Defensive ends, 82 and 80, not bad. One's a senior, one's a junior, there's not much behind them. Defensive tackle, a really bad situation. 72, 70, and it gets worse after that. Outside linebacker, one of your better players, impact guy, senior. And a bunch of really bad dudes beyond him, but at least you got bodies, I guess. Middle linebacker, a really bad situation. Your best guy, 68 overall, and just 74 speed. Corner, when I ran with Indiana that first season, I ran a lot of dime because they had so many cornerbacks that was better than my outside linebacker. So again, I ran a ton of dime just to get my best 11 players out there. Notice how many just okay cornerbacks you got. So that's just something to keep in mind. Free safety, not a good situation. Your best player is 68 overall with just 80 speed, really slow at that position. Strong safety, just 82 overall, then 72 behind him. Then you got kicker. Okay situation. You got an 84 overall junior and a freshman behind him. Then you got 2 punters. Actually, you got too many kickers and punters, so you may want to cut 1 or 2 depending on your situation if you want to bring in some extra players. Yeah, but otherwise, Indiana will always be a challenge. You're in a tough conference. You got to go up against Ohio State and Michigan, and recruiting will always be tough because Indiana just doesn't produce a lot of talent. But it should still be fun nonetheless. Next up, we have Kentucky, the Wildcats. Think about the situation. This is in the mid-2000s. This is way before Kentucky was winning anything 6 or 7 games a year. They just couldn't do much of anything. State of Kentucky does not produce a lot of talent. They're in a really tough conference, the SEC. They're in a really tough division. They got to go up against Tennessee, Florida, Georgia every single season. You also look at their current roster status. They got 22 seniors. Woof. Make full use of it. It's a double-edged sword. You got seniors that can really get you going out of the gate that first season, but once they're gone, you better get with it in recruiting. Otherwise, things get really tough. You also notice the roster in general, not much to work with. Your best players an 86 overall, then it's 82s after that. One of the worst up front rosters on the list. Quarterback, you got an impact guy, and he's a sophomore. Andre Woodson, good player back in the day. By the time he becomes a senior, I think you're going to make full use of him, but there's not a lot behind him. But at least you got a couple of guys that got some speed, so I just kind of want to keep that in mind. Halfback, average dudes for the conference. Fullbacks, a bunch of them. Okay, your best guy's a 78 speed, so that's something to keep in mind. But they run a pro-style offense. That's why you see so many fullbacks on the team. Wide receiver, you got an 82 impact guy with an 82 guy right beside him, and 78 and 78. So that's not bad, but it's still kind of bad for the conference. So you got some work to do here, and you got a bunch of seniors as well. Tight end, Jacob Tammy was at Kentucky what seemed like for 10 years, is pretty good. He's a redshirt senior, sophomore. So you can work with him. You got a guy behind him that's going to be okay, but just nothing special. Tackles, 76, 72, really bad. Guard, 76, 74, really bad. Center, 78. So your offensive line's got a lot of work to do. Notice the theme in this list. A lot of bad offensive lines and bad defensive lines. Speaking of defensive lines, defensive ends, 82. Darrell White, local kid, close to me. 82 overall, 78 speed, and 72 and 70. Just really bad situation. You got an 82 defensive tackle and a 78 behind him. That's not bad. We can take that, but just not much behind him. Outside linebacker, 76, 74, just a average situation. Middle linebacker, really bad. Now, they ran a 3-4 back then, so that's something you got to keep in mind. That's why you see so many middle linebackers here, but they're all obviously replaceable. Cornerbacks, not a good situation. 78, 74, and really bad behind them. You got some speed on the back end, though, on these lower ones. Free safeties, 74 and 74. Not a lot of speed there either. You got a really good strong safety, but he's a senior. He'll be gone, and nothing behind him. Kicker, 70 or 80 overall, senior. Not bad, but you only have him for a year. And you don't have really good punters. So, again, SEC, Kentucky, no tradition. Not a lot of talent to work with, tough recruiting ground, but will be a fun challenge for a dynasty. Next up, we have Ole Miss. We're going to stick with the SEC, and this was one of the last entries into my list. A lot of the reason was because of the recruiting and kind of what you got to deal with out of the gate. Now, Ole Miss, this is right when they fired Ed Orgeron, if I'm not mistaken, and I think they hired Houston Nutt. I think that's what happened there. And this is the state of Mississippi. It doesn't produce a ton of talent. In this game, it really doesn't. It's not terrible, but it's not great either. You look at their seniors, 20 of them, 14 juniors. So you got a lot of turnover out of the gate, but at least make full use of those seniors. They don't have any players in the 90s. You got several in the 80s. You keep on going down here. It's one of the longer lists of rosters that's got 80 and above. So let's look at their quarterback situation. Okay, 3 average guys, 80, 78, and 78, and they're all separated equally. You got a sophomore and a junior and a senior. That's a nice thing to have. One of them can run the ball a little bit. You go to halfback, Ben Jarvis Green Ellis, great player back in the day. You got a bunch of bodies, a bunch of average ones for the conference. Fullback, okay, 80 overall. He's a senior, got a little speed to him. Wide receiver, a good little group here, maybe the best receiving core you'll see on the list. Impact guy at 85. They got 84, 84, 82, 76. So they're built to go spread out of the gate. You go tight end, not much to work with here. More blockers than anything else. Offensive line, you got 87 and 80. You got Michael Orr. There's true freshman Michael Orr at 74. So not terrible situation to be in, but these two guys are 70s. You're going to have to recruit it. Guard, 78, 76, 74, just average. 84 at center, that's great, but he's a senior, so make full use of him. Defensive ends, 84 and 80, just okay, not terrible. You go to defensive tackle, a couple guys in the 80s and 78, 78. This isn't a really bad situation. The problem is you got majority of them are seniors. Outside linebacker, this is going to be the strength of your group, your linebackers on defense. 89 overall, impact guy. And some average guys behind him. Middle linebacker, Patrick Willis, Hall of Famer in the NFL, future Hall of Famer, great ball player. So you got 2 impact linebackers you're going to make full use of, at least you should, but there's nothing behind him. Cornerback, not bad, 88 and 82. You look at free safety, 82, not terrible, but nothing behind him. And a bunch of average strong safeties. You can actually run a little 3-2-5 or 3-3-5 and 4-2-5 with some of these guys. Might as well. Kicker, not very good. True freshman, 74, so I guess that's not a terrible situation to be in. You may want to cut one guy if needed, and you got a really bad freshman punter. So this is one of the better rosters on the list, but I wanted to include him because Mississippi is just hard to recruit in. You don't have a lot of surrounding states that are easy to recruit from. Texas is kind of close, but it's like 2 states over. And you're in the SEC. It's always going to be a challenge. Next up, we have Vanderbilt. This is arguably the worst team in the SEC every single season. And it's more or less the same in this game. Now, 2005, they actually had a decent year. This is when Jay Cutler was there. Notice he's their top player. But again, this is Vanderbilt. They don't have a ton of talent across the board, especially depth-wise. They're in the state of Tennessee that at the time did not produce a ton of talent. They also got a lot of seniors, so this is like the one-year gung-ho type situation until you really got to start doing some heavy recruiting. And they're an academic school, so if you want to add an academic restriction, this will be a good one to do so. Now, you look at their overall talent, 89, 87, 84, so they got a decent amount of guys in the 80s. But it gets kind of worse after that. So with quarterback, you got one great one. Jay Cutler, pocket passer, 89 overall, impact player. You're going to have to recruit this position. Very high priority for you first couple of seasons. Halfback, a bunch of average guys. They all got average speed. They all just scream average to me. You go to fullback, a bunch of them. They ran a pro-style offense back then. The good thing is you got some speed here. You can make some use of that in the passing game, maybe even in the running game. You go to wide receiver, you got an impact guy. So your passing game is going to be the strength of your offense with an impact quarterback and receiver. He's a senior, though, both him and Cutler. And then you got a junior at 82 and 76. So it's just okay, for the conference. Tight end, just okay. Nothing great here. You got a redshirt freshman that can run a little bit, but otherwise just not much. Tackles, 80 and 80, not bad, and just okay. Guard, 82, 78. 78, all just kind of scream average to me, but this kid's a senior. Defensive ends, 80, and just really bad beyond him. You look at defensive tackle, average, just your best guy's an 80. Outside linebacker, impact guy, great. Problem is he's a senior, so hopefully you can get full use out of him before he leaves, and you got to recruit after that for sure. Middle linebacker, not terrible. You got 2 average guys, so you may want to run a little 3-4 if you want to try to get your best 11 out there. Corners, nothing here. Your best guy's a 78 overall. You look at free safety, 78 overall, just 84 speed. And strong safety, 84. Problem is he's a senior and there is nothing behind him. And these are all really bad players. You're probably going to have to recruit over them. Kicker, you have 3, which is really, really goofy. You only really need 1, so you're going to have to do some maneuvering here if you want to get some extra spots in for some other more important positions. And you got an average punter. So again, it's Vanderbilt. It's in the SEC. It's in the state of Tennessee. It's going to be a tough situation overall, but at least you got plenty of seniors to work off of, so make full use of that first year before things get really tough. Next up, we have Cincinnati. They were a Big East team in 2005. This was their first year in the Big East, and I want to include a couple of Big East teams because, again, this is the BCS era, and the Big East was still kind of a thing back then. So with Cincinnati, you got a positive. They're in the state of Ohio. That's great. Incredible recruiting to work from. You don't have to go very beyond that to go after, get better players. You can recruit Pennsylvania, which is right beside you. So in terms of recruiting long-term, it should be okay. The problem is there's just not a lot of talent to work with here, and you don't have a lot of seniors. That's both a positive and a negative, which means you don't have a lot of top-end guys that can really help you out of the gate, but they got a ton of juniors to go with it. Now, you look at their top 5 or 6 players. Your best player is a tight end at 89 overall, so nobody in the 90s. And you got a handful of dudes in the 80s, and that's about it. So go to quarterback. This is your biggest problem. You don't have much to work with here, a bunch of pocket passers that can't do much of anything. Can you survive that first year until you can bring in some better players? You go to halfback. Average dudes, but you got 5 average dudes, so you're going to be running the ball quite a bit with these guys. Fullback, they ran a pro-style offense, 74 overall, 76 speed. So you got some speed there that can help you block off the edge and such. Wide receiver, your best guys are in the upper 70s. You got 3 78 overalls, one of them is an impact guy, and he's a senior. So you'll probably be doing some 21-11 personnel with this team. Tight end, again, your best player, 89 overall, 76 speed, and he's just a junior. Really nice to have. And notice all 3 of your tight ends have some speed to them. You go to tackle, you got one decent one at 85 overall, and it's a bit of a drop-off after that. You got guards, one decent one, and a drop-off after that. You got a center, 80 overall. He's a senior, and he's gone after 1 year. So your offensive line's going to need some work. Defensive ends, you got 3 guys in the 80s. 2 of them are seniors and 1 is an impact guy. So try to make full use of them while you can. Defensive tackles, average. Your best guy's 78 overall. Outside linebacker, really bad situation. Your best one's 74 overall. At least you don't have any seniors, so these are all young pups, more or less. Middle linebacker, no seniors, and you got 1 decent one at 78 overall, so it's not terrible, I guess. You got a bad situation at cornerback. Your best one, 74 overall. And you got a free safety, okay. Good thing here is he is a sophomore for an 80 overall. That's not bad, and he's got a decent backup behind him. You got a strong safety. This is worse, 74 overall, and really bad players below that. Kicker, pretty good, 86 overall, and he's a junior. And you got a punter that's a senior, 82 overall, with a guy behind him you could redshirt. So that's a good situation to be in right there. So Cincinnati, they're one of the worst teams in the Big East just because they came into it. You don't have much to work with, but if you think long-term, recruiting can be very beneficial to you just because you're in the state of Ohio. The last team on our list is Rutgers. Now, I picked them for a couple of reasons. One of them, they're in the Big East, and they're one of the worst teams in the Big East, but it's still kind of doable. The Big East isn't the strongest conference out there, especially in this game, but they got some challenges. One is they're up in the Northeast where there's not a lot of recruiting to be had. Now, they're in New Jersey. The good thing is New Jersey actually produces a decent amount of talent up there, and you don't have a lot of competition. You also are close to Pennsylvania, so recruiting won't be terrible. The biggest problem with Rutgers, though, is look how many upperclassmen you got. 22 juniors and 28 seniors. I mean, 3/4 of your team will be gone in 2 years. So recruiting is going to be super crucial those first couple of seasons. Now, you look at their overall talent, the top 5 or 6 players. You got a 97 overall fullback. Then you got a bunch of mid-80 guys and below. And notice they don't have a ton of guys in the 80s. So going to quarterback, you got an impact guy, senior pocket passer. Make full use of them. After that, you don't have much to work with, although you got a true freshman right here that's got some speed to him. So that's something to think about. Halfback, a bunch of average dudes. Notice there's Ray Rice on the list. He was a true freshman back then. Fullback, 97 overall. Again, your best player. And if you remember, Rutgers was really good about 2 or 3 years after this, and that's why they just have some young pups to really work off of. And this guy's just a junior. So they ran a pro-style offense. Notice all the fullbacks you had there. Wide receiver, 85, 82, and just okay, not a bad group for the conference, I guess. Tight end, 1 decent one. He's a senior, 78 speed. You can make use of that, but there's nothing behind him. Tackles, not very good. 76, 76, and 1's a senior. You go to guard, 78, senior. Guard as a sophomore and a junior. So it's just, again, average for the conference. Center, 74, 74. So your offensive line isn't all that great out of the gate, so you need to prioritize it. Defensive ends, impact guy, 85 overall. He's a senior, so make full use of him. Then you got a defensive end at 80 and 74. Just okay. You got plenty of bodies at least. Defensive tackle, not very good. 74, 72, and worse after that. Outside linebackers, 80, and just a bunch of average dudes behind him. So you got bodies at least. The problem is you got a bunch of seniors. Your top 4 guys are all seniors, and your 4th best one's an impact guy. Just a really weird situation. Middle linebacker, 78 overall and 70 behind him, but that's it. So you need to get some extra bodies here unless you want to move somebody over, maybe down the road. Cornerback, 82, and then 78 and 76. Just okay. Free safety, 80, 74, just okay. Strong safety, 82, senior, just okay. So their secondary is just average. You go kickers, you got 2 of them, 78 and a 74. You can redshirt possibly this guy, so you can use this one, and you can get an extra year out of him. Punter, senior, 80 overall, not bad. So again, Rutgers, the biggest issue is the turnover of your roster those first couple seasons. You got so many players leaving, unless you want to redshirt some seniors. Most of the time, you don't want to do that. You just want to get in some newer guys come in. But it's an interesting challenge, and just being up in the Northeast, it just makes it a little bit different, and it should be a fun dynasty. The last thing I want to do is mention a few other teams, sort of as honorable mentions, more or less. The first one is Stanford. The only reason I didn't put them in my top 10 is because they're the state of California, and California has so many amount of prospects to choose from. Even if you put an academic restriction on your dynasty with Stanford, it's still going to be a little bit easier for you just because you're so close to so much great talent. over there on the West Coast. They got some upperclassmen, but you notice they got quite a few guys in the 80s. But again, Stanford's never had much tradition of success until Jim Harbaugh got there, but it still is something to think about. Next up, we're going to go over to the SEC, and we're going to go over to Mississippi State. It was either them or Ole Miss. They're in a similar situation. The only reason why I didn't pick them was because they got slightly more talent than Ole Miss, and they don't have a ton of upperclassmen. So you got a couple years to work with to do some roster turnover without feeling the need to get as many players as possible. And last but not least is another Big East team, which I think is an interesting dynasty idea, and that is UConn. UConn, of course, doesn't have any tradition of football whatsoever. They're in Connecticut. No talent comes out of that state, no offense. And they're up in the Northeast. There's just not a lot of talent up there in general. They got a decent amount of players, and they got like a 92. I mean, look at their backfield. 92 fullback, 88 halfback, 87 halfback, and their 2 halfbacks are impact players. Impact halfbacks are like the easiest things to work with. And just having that out of the gate, I felt like that made things a little bit easier. And they're both juniors. Imagine if both of them came back. You'd have 2 years with 2 impact guys. Either way, long term, this will be a really tough challenge just because they're in the state of Connecticut. All right. I hope you enjoy this list, and I'll talk to you later.